Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, from whichever part of the world you're joining us from. My name is Chandani Jaswal. I'm a communication member at the Museum of British Colonialism. We're a transnational network who are working towards understanding the colonial histories of the erstwhile British colonies, which includes most parts of the world today. We're very, very delighted to have Sam Dalrymple with us, who will be discussing his latest book, his debut book, Shattered Lands. This is the book. I've had the privilege of reading this book in this winter, and it was an absolute marvel to read. A very new insight into the partitions of what we today call as the Indian subcontinent. And Sam goes on to tell us that it was not just the subcontinent as we know today that was partitioned. There were some appendages to it as well that we don't actually talk about, the eastern side and the western side, which includes that the Indian Empire stretched us as far as Oman of today to what is known as Burma or Myanmar today. And he goes on to talk at length about it using oral history records. So thank you, Sam, for accepting our invitation. And we'll get into the interview right away.
Like,
So, Sam, at the outset of the book, of course, you mentioned in the introduction that the Indian Empire, and I quote, consists of the usual suspects, that is India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal. And of course, you said that more interestingly, it talks about Yemen and Oman and UAE and Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait, unquote. So, why is it that it took nearly 80 years for the lateral sides of the Indian Empire to come to light? Why were they not discussed before? Why are the people not aware about it?
this is, I think, at the heart of the book. The fact that we've completely missed about kind of, one third of the former Indian Empire whenever we talk about the Raj. I think that every subsequent nation state that emerged from the Raj has created these national mythologies. And so, like the separation of Burma features heavily in Burmese education, but it doesn't in India, which focuses very much on the central trauma of 1947. And in particular, this kind of mythologized, supposedly natural geography of Bharatvarsh, which was, as I talk about in the book, explicitly carved out of the Raj by separating the eastern and western sides so that the geography matched that of the ancient Mahabharata, basically. And yet, it's taken in the certainly in the textbooks that I grew up with in Delhi as the kind of natural state of being that was later carved up itself, leaving out the earlier partitions. Likewise, I think the UAE and the former princely states that have survived from the Raj, Nepal, Bhutan, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE have focused on the kind of inevitability of their monarchies surviving, thus brushing and they focus their education systems tend to focus on links with Britain, but not so much with the lateral links with India and the fact that they were governed as Indian princely states for almost 100 years, just like Jaipur, Jodhpur, Kashmir, Hyderabad, Bhavalpur, etc. And so I think that the kind of national myths that we fall into have tended to obscure the sheer scale of what was going on, and the fact that this is a story that addresses 1/4 of the world's population.
You talk about Mahatma Gandhi's arrival both in Burma as well as in the Arab state, and you say that he received a resounding sort of an applause as soon as he decks, and then he talks about something which was not quite liked by the people because he never really envisaged these parts as constituting the Indian subcontinent. So, and then you also mention in a footnote in your correspondence with the historian working on the Arab colony that the Arabs were quote unquote unbothered by India. So how bothered or how affected were they by Mahatma Gandhi's policies like the NDC, the non civil disobedience movement or the non-cooperation movement, and did they look at Gandhi as a person who would quote unquote free them from the British rule, or was he regarded because he was a person who's done a lot for the subcontinent or a person who made a mark in the early part of the 20th century?
I mean, this is a brilliant question, and I think that the question of how Indian people began to feel as a result of being tacked onto India is a fascinating one. Certainly, you have a huge number of Burmese activists and major politicians, notably this guy Uottama, who feel like they're Indian and feel that Burmese people are Indians, and they don't understand why India has to be defined by ancient epics written 5,000 years ago when, they've been part of this Indian nation building for so long, and their biggest political party is the National Congress. And, this Burmese politician Uottama ends up as the head of the Hindu Mahasabha, only replaced but later by a man called Savarkar. And so, the politics of these regions is immensely tied. I think the Arab states had a lot less of a sense of Indian identity outside of the city of Aden. So certainly Arab aristocracies began to feel Indian. So you had the Sultan of Oman was sent off to Mayo College, Rajasthan, where he became more fluent than he was in Urdu than he was in Arabic. And as a result, the army titles of Oman remained Urdu right till the 1960s. If you ask the average person in Dubai what they felt like, they would have felt, Arab or maybe Khaliji, Gulfi, basically. There was but I think that is more to do with the fact that they were princely states. And I think what we forget is the extent to which, likewise, many Hyderabadis didn't feel particularly Indian. Many Baluchis didn't feel particularly Indian. Many people in huge numbers of princely states. You still go to Rajasthan today, and although there is a strong Indian nationalism, there is also still, almost 80 years later, a loyalty to the erstwhile state, be it Mewar, Marwar, Dhundar, Bikaner, etc. And I think that is a remnant of these former state identities. So yeah, the civil disobedience movements were massive in Burma. They were celebrated in Aden. All of the discussions around the Salt March take place with reference to Aden and Adney salt, because a lot of salt came from Aden. Um, so, identity varied, but certainly what's interesting is within the Arab states, there wasn't as much Indian identity that was crystallizing, but there was at least one major journalist called Muhammad Ali Luqman, who's one of the founding fathers of Yemen, right? And he, at least in his early years, considers himself an Indian nationalist. He becomes Ambedkar's travel buddy. He becomes Gandhi's translator in Gujarati and Arabic. And I think he begins to envision a future, at least for a time, where Arab is an Indian ethnicity alongside Punjabi, Bengali, Tamil, Telugu, etc. And obviously we don't live in that world, but we shouldn't use the present day to look at the past, if that makes sense. At the time, it's fascinating how open to many possibilities the future was. There were people who were arguing that you just remove Britain from the top and an Indian government rule this entire region between Yemen and Myanmar. But that, of course, did not come to light.
Your answer actually, I can segue into multiple aspects of the book because it's so varied. But I'll segue into the one that talks about Mahatma Uttama. And what I really found interesting was that Mahatma Uttama liked the Gandhian philosophy, and so did a person called Sen Gupta. And
Mm.
yet, they were supporting Mahatma Gandhi, but they were talking about an Indo-Burma union at the same time. Whereas Mahatma Gandhi was very clear initially when he came to Burma that you can decide that Burma is not a part of the Indian Empire or the Bharatvash, and then later he said that you can decide about it. So how did people who were following Mahatma Gandhi in Burma look at this relationship or sort of a dichotomy in their understanding of the Burmese identity with the mainland Indian identity? Did they sort of respectfully maintain a distance that we follow Mahatma Gandhi's ahimsa policy, but we do not agree with the fact that he says that Burma should not be a part of the Indian subcontinent empire? How did they liaise these two identities together?
I think it's important to recognize how many varying interpretations of what was going on there were. Mahatma Uttama was Gandhi's main acolyte in the region. He gained the title Mahatma because he was known for bringing the Mahatma's policies to Burma. They later fall out because of Gandhi's support for Burma's separation from India. Um, but the relationship, I think that the way to imagine Burmese identity within Indian nation is basically how I think a lot of Northeasterners are often treated with regard to India. As somewhat an appendage. Many Northeasterners feel intensely Indian. Some feel very alienated by the Indian nation because of the way that they've been treated racistly by people in Delhi or Bombay. And I think that that same thing applied even further east to the easternmost province, as well as Assam, but also to Burma. There were many people who felt intensely Indian. There were many people who felt the racism was too much to bear. And what's interesting is how it changes in the course of the 1930s. The bankers in the region were all Tamils, Chettiar bankers. Today you can still visit Chettinad in Tamil Nadu, and there's these beautiful teak mansions made from Burmese teak and all these Burmese-inspired dishes that are eaten in this part of Tamil Nadu. That is great while it lasts, but during the Great Depression, um, hundreds of the farmers who are relying on their loans default on their debts simultaneously. And because there's not enough money to repay the debts, they start seizing land instead of seizing debts. And this one community from Chettinad becomes saddled with a quarter of all Burmese agricultural land. And this creates a massive backlash against Indian immigrants in the region. Already there had been this kind of whole debate about, are we truly Indian? In the wake of the Great Depression, everything changes. And it just so happens that the Great Depression also triggers a rebellion in Burma, the Sayasan Rebellion. It's the largest rebellion the Raj had seen since 1857. It actually expanded all the way to Nagaland, and even the Chittagong Hill Tracts the Chittagong Armory raid were all part of the same rebellion. What's extraordinary, I think, is the extent to which the British response is sending in the Indian Army, and the Indian Army is mostly Punjabi and Pathan, and Kashmiri and Nepali Gurkha. And as a result, in a world where already there's this growing anti-Indian sentiment, suddenly there's Indian troops shooting up Burmese villages. And that's the final straw that breaks the camel's back. So although in the late 1920s, I think many Burmese people feel that their future should be with India, that they should belong as like an equal partner in this kind of all Indian union alongside Punjabis and Kashmiris and Tamils, etc. By 1935, that world has sort of disappeared because of this growth, because of this series of cascading events that basically is triggered all by the Great Depression. Much like, so much of the craziness of today's politics can be traced to the 2008 financial crash. So the Great Depression of the 1930 completely transforms India's relationship with Burma. And of course, by April Fool's Day 1937, the first partition has carved it off from India. It's a partition, interestingly, that directly inspires all the other ones to come.
You talk about the Sayasan rebellion, and you've talked extensively about it in the book as well. And I must admit that it's a revelation to discuss about it. Having studied history for 5 years, yet we don't really discuss about the Burmese rebellion, right? We just discuss about the impact that it had on this side of the border. Like you said, we sort of project in
Silo the histories
yeah,
is
definitely.
what there's a scholar I was chatting to recently who was saying how Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East are today studied by completely separate groups of scholars. And all the Southeast Asian scholars are studying Thailand will know about the Sayasan Rebellion, but somehow it's not studied in India, despite the fact that Burma was part of India at the time.
and and like you said, that it's not just that India is a part of it in political sense or in the sense of administration, that it's a part of the Indian Empire. Bengalis are also fighting in that rebellion, and then they're also being targeted by the Burmese who don't see them as part of the Burmese nationality. So again, we have a sort of a dichotomy here. You have Bengali revolutionaries fighting alongside the Burmese, but then you have the Bengalis also being attacked because they don't look Burmese enough. So what and but the Sayasen rebellion also wanted a union with India. So is this sort of a confusion that we see here? Is this confusion real at that time as well? That people really did not know what they're doing; they were just fighting. That there was this sort of a headiness or sort of a herd mentality that there's a rebellion on ground, or is
Well,
it just that you're looking at it
I,
backwards?
I think it's again much like what later happens with India and Pakistan, that you had all of these freedom fighters, regardless of religion, all on the same side. And when you imagine the role of, for example, Maulana Azad, one of the former Congress presidents, Muslim man who's at the head of Congress at the moment when sort of India-Pakistan tensions begin and they kind of lead up to 1947's partition. I think in much the same way that he gets trapped between these two sides that suddenly see Hindus and Muslims as a dichotomy, whereas Maulana Azad sees them as very much as part of one nation. So a lot of the Bengali revolutionaries who are part of the Burmese freedom struggle get caught in the middle of this growing anti-Indian sentiment as it clashes with their own revolutionary aims.
And this was more of a query as a reader. So when the Burma's partition happens on, like you said, April Fool's Day, 1937, it was not followed by the immediate migration of the Tamil and the Bengali communities, right? It happened over the years, like you showed us through Uttama Singh's diary entry as well. So it's happened over years. It was not immediate. Am I right in thinking
Yeah.
that?
So initially nothing much happens, but there's this guy called Usaw, who's the kind of criminal of the piece, who's this xenophobic anti-Indian politician who gradually seizes power over the course of the next 3 years. He basically triggers a series of anti-Indian riots. But still, the Indians don't leave Burma. The moment that they finally leave is when the Japanese invade during World War II. We're about a year before Subhash Chandra Bose gets involved. And the Indian community had increasingly basically worried about their relationships with the Burmese, but they were like, well, at least the Brits have managed to put down any anti-Indian pogroms, and the Indian army is still going to be there for us. The moment that the Japanese invade and suddenly there's no police there, and suddenly there's no, the Brits are gone, is the moment that 366,000 Indians flee Burma overnight in what's known as the Long March. It's one of the most forgotten partition migrations. And yet today, even today, when you go to bits of Punjab or bits of Bengal or bits of Tamil Nadu, you can meet the descendants of these people. There's in Chennai, there's still the Burma Bazaar, for example, which was an area where a lot of Tamils from Rangoon began to settle. There's a town called More in Manipur, where a lot of people settled. And so, there's many different places, but it's one of the most important migrations that changed the fate of the subcontinent.
You talked about the Nagas, and of course, when the Burma's partition, like you discussed in the book, was underway, the Naga community becomes a question mark because four fifth of them are in present day India, and a fifth of them are in present day Myanmar.
Yeah.
And whenever we read about partition histories, let's talk about the Punjab. So whenever we read about partition histories in the Punjab, there's this sort of a lament with respect to Watan or homeland, right? They're not just lamenting colonization; they're lamenting the loss of homeland. So do we see a similar lament about loss of Watan, loss of homeland in Naga accounts? And why is again
Yes.
it not being discussed so much?
Well, again, I mean, I think it's just again this focus on national security when talking about Nagaland rather than what are Nagas themselves actually saying. If you read any of the early accounts of the Naga independence struggle and the kind of the separatist movement that emerged in the Northeast India, the earliest accounts never talk about separatism. They talk about reuniting the two homelands. And so the entirety of the Naga independence movement from India was rooted in an attempt to reconnect two divided sides of a single homeland. Likewise, a lot of Mizo, separatist movement in Northeast India emerges from trying to reconnect Mizos on both sides of the Indo-Burmese borders. So I think that far too often, we treat the borders as some natural given state rather than something that's rupturing through communities. I think we're used to talking about it in Punjab, primarily, actually, because of the fact that basically kind of Punjab has produced so many internationally renowned cities. I mean, Amritsar, Delhi, it's where it's near the political center, and Punjabis abroad have been telling their stories. And so I think there's more films about it, etc. Whereas there's not that many films about Naga perspectives. And when Naga perspectives are put on film, it's always in relation to the violence that racked across Nagaland in years afterwards, rather than this more fascinating time when it could have ended up in either country. It could have ended up as a separate country. There's a whole range of nations that begin to emerge and demand their own independence in the 1940s that don't. get their independence. Notably, there's Nagaland, there's the Khalistan, there's independent Kashmir, there's independent, there's hundreds of independent Balochistan, there's hundreds of states that were made various promises at certain points by Brits, by Indian government officials in the 1940s. And so many of the secessionist movements that emerge in South Asia subsequently have their roots there.
You talk about secessionist movements, and you mention at the fag end of your book that the fact that India had reorganized itself on the basis of language in a way helped avert a situation similar to Pakistan with respect to what happened in now Bangladesh, right? S- and you also draw sort of a parallel between the reorganization of India on the basis of language with respect to another country happening at around the same time that it was happening in Bengal. So, is it right to say that the movement of nationalism that was imposed in the later Pakistan and Bangladesh was a top-down approach, whereas the organization of states on the basis of language was an upward sort of a bottoms-up approach, or was it just smart statesmanship on the part of independent Indian statesmen when they had reorganized it and sort of averted a bigger crisis?
It's a mix of both. I think that because India continues today and because Pakistan was split in 1971 and Bangladesh emerged, I think we tend to overlook how close it came to forging a united nation. And for me, the big turning point is actually the military coup. It's like, despite the kind of suppression of languages, despite all the other things, I think language plays a huge role in uh, the India's creating states on the basis of language has done a huge amount to stabilize the country. And any politicians who today say that we'll be better off by imposing Hindi on everyone is completely wrong and hasn't spent enough time in the South or in the Northeast or anywhere that's not Hindi speaking. Um, I think that that certainly wounds Pakistan from its birth. But I think the key thing that destroys it is the military takes over, and the military is not representative of the country. The military was hugely Punjabi dominated, and there were only 2% Bengalis in the military, despite the fact that Bengalis were the majority of the country. And so when they replaced the civilian, in the first decade, four of the first eight Pakistani prime ministers are of Bengali extraction, and then four come in, and it's roughly equal, it's roughly representative. But military rule destroys that representation. Suddenly, very quickly, all funds begin to be diverted towards West Pakistan. East Pakistan loses out in all sorts of ways, and things begin to go south from there.
You talk about the idea of Bharatvarsh and how that the idea of the undivided India, as it's popular at least in the Indian memory, it was there only for a few months, and it was created for the purpose of partitioning the Indian Empire. But when we study India in the early modern period, we talk about there's the 16th century account which says that that Camby's arms extend, one goes to Malacca and the other goes to Aden. So
Yeah.
in a way, the Indian Empire that the British colonial powers envisaged centuries later was a product of the trade linkages that the early modern Indian administration had. Would it be right to say that?
Yes, I mean the reason that the East India Company conquers where it does is because it's following the trade, it's following the money, it's trying to control the Indian Ocean trade, and it conquers accordingly. And so it's what becomes the Raj is essentially all the areas conquered by the East India Company that after 1857 is nationalized and becomes the Raj, and it stops being a company, it starts being ruled from the crown. Around that time, places like Hong Kong, Somaliland, and Singapore were all separated off because they were also conquered by the East India Company, but they're never placed under, and likewise Sri Lanka is never placed under the like given an Indian passport, basically. What's remarkable though is how much of um, the region is placed under sort of the Indian viceroyalty for 100 years.
So, I mean, of course, as students of history and as a writer of history, one cannot go into what ifs, but in a way, can one surmise from here that the unfolding that happened, at least in the first three partitions, was in a way inevitable because it was always a top-down approach of imposing one currency, one passport entity, because they were never historically or culturally united with each other, and that this was bound to happen one way or the other. It was just a matter of time.
You have big tent nationalisms and you have small tent nationalisms. So, for example, you know, Indian nationalism can coexist with smaller nationalisms like Tamil nationalism and Punjabi nationalism and Rajasthani nationalism. You know, like you can feel both proudly Rajasthani and proudly Indian, right? I think that this is there's always an ability to create some constitutional settlement that allows for all of these identities to emerge. You know, early in the early days, there was a lot of discussion that we've now forgotten about you know some sort of United States of South Asia. Both Nehru talks about it, Aung San talks about it, Jinnah pushes for it. Everyone wants it initially, you know, and today, of course, we have these very hard national borders, which are not normal. You know, you don't have those in most of the rest of the world. You go to Europe and you're able to kind of happily travel from A to B to C. And I think that certainly, you know, for example, when I chat to a lot of Emiratis, they talk about, well, you know, yes, you know, the oil us being separated meant that the oil wealth didn't go to India, but like had we become Indian or Pakistani, it would have led to a kind of neo-colonial relationship where people settled and tried to basically kind of seep our oil and take our wealth. Um, and you know, one group inheriting the wealth just from empire means it's just a new empire. Um, so certainly there's a question about how feasible any such state would have been. But there are numerous states that have proven that that is possible, notably Indonesia, right? Indonesia's even more languages and has no basis in a pre-colonial state. You know, it is based off basically unifying all these islands that were unified under the Dutch, but and often have quite different. You know, the history of Java and Sumatra is very different from the history of Papua and and um, and Sulawesi, and yet they've managed to bring together these different identities under a large umbrella. I think that what was different in South Asia is a the focus on religious nationalisms. Um, but but again, what's interesting is how each of the partitions, each of the five partitions that tears India apart in this period, is on the basis of something different. It showed, you know, like Burma was not separated by religion; it was separated by ethnicity. Um, Likewise, you know, Bangladesh was separated on the basis of language and war. The Arab states were separated just by matter of convenience because the Brits kind of wanted a toehold in the region, and the Indian government actively turned down inheriting them. This is again one of the big discoveries of the book is the fact that the Brits offered Dubai, Kuwait, Qatar, etc., to the Indian government, and the Indian officials turn it down, saying that it'll be too much, too costly on the exchequer. Oil hadn't been discovered yet.
And we must talk about the unique lens through which we get to see as readers different parts of Indian history. So we talk about the Simon Commission a lot, but every time I have read Simon Commission, it's that people have hoisted black flags and they're welcoming the commission. And
Yeah.
yet the initial part of the book looks at the Simon Commission from the perspective of the commissioners. And what's a very interesting revelation was that one of them was a future Prime Minister of England. Attlee was there.
Not yeah, not just a future prime minister, but the prime minister who grants India independence.
Yes.
You know, like it's him, not Winston Churchill, who sends Mountbatten out to India as the viceroy.
So what really caught my attention was that they were here, and you mentioned this, they were here to work on the constitutional history of India. And yet the India that they're talking about is Bangladesh, Pakistan, India of today, right? Because when they talk at Aden, they're not looking at constitutional history of that part of the Indian Empire. They're still talking about Bombay and
Well,
Delhi.
they were. So when the Simon Commission arrives in the late 1920s, they arrive in Aden as an Indian city. and they talk about Aden as an Indian city, and they have brief discussions about whether the Bombay presidency should be separate. Likewise, they are the first to. The reason that I opened there is that it's the last moment when anything was really possible. And I think that there was all the nationalism. You had Burmese people who felt Indian, you had Yemenis who felt Indian, and you had Burmese people who didn't, Yemenis who didn't. You had Hyderabadis who felt Indian and Hyderabadis who didn't feel Indian. And anything was possible, and anything could have been forged with the right politics. What's interesting about that's what I find the most interesting about the Simon Commission, and they are explicitly put in charge, although knowing absolutely nothing about the subcontinent, they are put in charge with suggesting the creation of the first constitution of India. And that never comes into effect, but it's a hugely important moment because they are the first to suggest that Burma be partitioned. They are the first to suggest all sorts of constitutional reforms that lead to the rise of Pakistan, etc. And I just, for me, it was also a fascinating because they write about their travels. So you can follow them through their letters as they're going across Punjab, Balochistan.
We can't hear you, Sam, suddenly. Hello?
Yes, hello?
Oh, we lost you for a second.
Sorry.
We can hear you again. No, no problem. If you could
Um,
repeat the last line that you said.
no, I was just saying what is fascinating about the Simon Commission is you can also really get a sense of the vastness of the Indian Empire because they travel to every state. They travel to Yemen. They travel to Punjab. They travel to Kashmir. They travel to Tripura. They travel to Assam. They travel to Tamil Nadu. They travel to Burma. And you can follow them and see it's a snapshot of the subcontinent as a whole, in some sense, or the Indian Empire as a whole, just before the process of partitioning begins. And at a moment, interestingly, where they meet Jinnah, but Jinnah's still a congressman, and he enters the room with Lala Lajpat Rai as his kind of compatriot. So it's a world before any of the political pieces that we're used to studying are really have come into effect.
Just before we go to the next question, dear audience members who have joined us for this Zoom call, you can put your questions in the chat box or use the raise hand feature. At the end of our discussion, I will open the forum up for question answers from the audience. Anyway, going back to the concept that you talked about Jinnah and Lala Lajpat Rai entering the room together, what really surprised me in the book, and of course, as a student of history, studying the history of India in India, was how you humanize all the people of the or the trinity that we know from the 1920s, whether it's Mahatma Gandhi, whether it's Jinnah, whether it's Nehru. You humanize them, and which is often missing. I won't say most at all times, but often missing in histories written by writers living in the subcontinent. So
Mm.
is it in the way the fact that it takes can we say that this is a product of colonialism itself, that you don't get to look at the people who helped you gain independence or helped you shape the history of the world as you know it today because you're from that subcontinent, so you don't get to look at your leaders very objectively from that point of time. And how much and is this intentional? Is this a broad process of colonial education or colonization and the decolonization that subsequently happened, anti-colonialism? You need
I
to be an
think
outsider to look at
yeah.
them objectively.
Well, I think it's less this specific thing that you're talking about, I think is less to do with colonialism and actually far more to do with um I think that there's a mix. For one, what every country in the world tries to lionize its own national pantheon, essentially, and in a sense, is the last people that you should trust on any of these people frequently. Speak to a Brit on Churchill, and they will brush over 90% of the kind of horrors that Churchill inflicts upon the rest of the world. And likewise, chat to an American about its founding fathers, and they'll often brush over the kind of slavery that was going on at the time and all the rest of it, right? So I think that there's been an intense valorization and trying to make simplistic narratives of good versus evil, or kind of particularly with Jinnah. Jinnah in Pakistan is revered as this kind of Islamic founder of the Islamic nation. And in India, he's regarded as the chief kind of villain, saying, I will destroy India, kind of thing. And the complex story of this kind of secular Muslim man who initially is regarded as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity, has an interfaith marriage, drinks alcohol, eats pork, and then through a series of tragedies, including his wife's suicide, gradually hardens and becomes more fearful, and and is reacting to a series of very real pogroms that were occurring against the Muslim community and attempts to reduce Muslim seats in parliament, so that eventually he comes to the conclusion that he need, to make the Pakistan demand. It's a far more complex story, and one that actually I think strikes one as much more of a human story. Um, but it doesn't make for easy heroes or villains. Likewise, um, I think following each of them through the tragedies and ups and downs in their lives, um, and often the kind of more sinister aspects of their personality. I think one of the things that's hit a lot of people is that Sardar Patel is, whilst extraordinary, unifying the nation, Statue of Unity, etc., has all sorts of very chillingly calculated moves that lead to very many pogroms. And I think that and again, it's not the easy lionized version of this national figure that I think people are used to seeing.
As a sort of a penultimate question, as a semi-parting sort of way, you've looked at various tragedies, whether it's the attack of the Japanese on Burma, whether it's the migration in the Long March that happened through oral accounts, whether it's the oral accounts that you collected yourself or oral accounts mentioned in the book. And of course, all of us know of your work in Project Dastan. So now, as a writer, as a public historian who's working with oral testimonies, which are often sort of rubbished off because memories are fickle, and as a writer, as a public historian, how do you liaise between the two? How does one overcome the obstacles of working with oral testimonies as a source or source material for your research work?
This is a great question and one that I feel quite passionately about. I feel like there's an attempt to denigrate oral history. We all know that it relies on people's memory and but I think it's important to remember that so does memoirs, and no one ever talks about memoirs as you treat sources as sources, you criticize them, you wrestle with them, you look for biases, and you judge it against the other evidence. Everyone's very used to treating memoirs in this way. But so we should treat oral history in the same way. We look for potential conflicts of interests. We look at all this, but I think that it's never been more important to get oral histories down. We're losing the generation who lived through the most important event in one of the most important events in world history, right? And I think that by collecting these different sources and just treating them, as you said, as sources, they're a source of something. Some are trustworthy, some are not. It's but they're always worth something, and it's often the things that people unwittingly just mention that are the most important things, not the you can always tell what the thing that they're trying to tell you is, and then there's a whole host of information that appears in the background that's often far more interesting.
Thank you, Sam. I'll open the forum for Q&A because I have a few questions in my kitty with respect to your work with Project Dasta, but I'll keep them on the back burner. And if the audience has questions, we'll take those up right now. You can put those questions in the chat box or use the raise hand feature, and I can unmute you then. All right. Whilst the audience is thinking about it, so of course, one needs to talk about the fact that you're writing your debut book comes out at a time when the social media is a huge rage. So, so how do you look at the inside of social media, or how do you look at the world of social media? Is it something that needs to be feared? And how have you dealt with, the positive and the negative of writing, as I might say, as the son of a very famous writer father? So, how has social media helped you in that? Or is it always been the popularity that comes with writing in the public eye? Is it been negative? How do you deal with it as a writer, so in a very personal space, as Sam?
Yeah, I think so there's the public facing things like like TV previously, it's a different form of media. I think it's very important when charging onto social media to realize that about 70% of things that you see are bots and 30% of things that you see are people. And this is more and more. So anyone who I know who has ever had a public facing profile on social media will receive huge amounts of hate, mostly not from people. It's always the same few recycled, often now AI generated lines. Um, at the same time, I don't think that this book would have been possible without social media. I was put in touch with so with Project Astan, it was through social media that many partition survivors reached out to us, and that we managed to kind of, create a team transnationally who could help us track down ancestral homelands across the border, etc. That was only possible through social media. It was through social media that I got put in touch with the family of Feroz Khan Noon, the last independent prime minister of Pakistan before the military coup, whose papers are all sitting in this house in Lahore that scholars had never gone through before. So I think that social media can be a huge boon, but there are dangers, and there are also just kind of mental health aspects for sure. There's also a weirdness about kind of a lot of people think like the parasocial relationships are very weird. A lot of people think that they're your best friend because they followed you on Instagram, and I don't know who you are. You've not introduced yourself, and it's very odd that aspect. You meet people who've been following you for 2 years, and if they introduce themselves, it's really nice to meet people, but it gets very strange at the same time. And again, I know a lot of people who've had very, very similar experiences. And sometimes you need to kind of be take a step back a bit. And likewise, I think there's a big deal about making sure there's a huge amount of slop on social media, but I think it can be a brilliant tool for researchers to get their work out to a public audience. I'm a big believer that research needs to get outside just the academe and reach a wider audience, and that these can be tools for teaching. Um, you know, so much of our news that we see today is on social media, for good or for ill. We live in this 21st century world, and I think it's important to realize, how much heritage I know through heritage influencers. A bunch of heritage influencers and I helped organize the saving of a series of monuments in Meroli that were being demolished, and were often 13th century kind of shrines and tombs and stuff. That wouldn't be possible without social media and the outcry that it helped us create. At the same time, we all know that the awful stuff that social media produces, and I don't need to go into that any further.
I must say that you are one of the most helpful guides that are out there on social media. The work that you do on the Substack newsletter, whether it's
Thank you.
about this forgotten place in Gore, it is very interesting to look at it, and sort of almost lament as well, because I often talk about it, the ease with which you travel from Lahore to Delhi to Dhaka. It's as if I'm traveling from Chandigarh to Delhi. So
Um,
that really gives us a way. So that would not have been possible if we did not have social media for people across these countries to look at the forgotten monuments. So thank you for the work that you're doing on Substack as well. There's a question from Aditya who thanks you for the talk, and he says, could you please shed some light on the general principles states should keep in mind based on the history of partition when drawing or reorganizing borders?
well, I think you've hit, Aditya, a really important point, which is what is a good partition border. I think that, when Cyril Radcliffe is asked to draw a new border, so there are two types of borders that we see in South Asia today, for example. One is where the British Empire happened to stop. And so, for example, the Durand Line, which divides Pashtuns between Afghanistan and Pakistan, is an example of kind of, the Brits conquered one half and didn't conquer the other half. Likewise, India's border with China, which used to be Tibet, was where the British reached and they didn't go any further. And likewise, Burma's border with Thailand is the same. And then you've got the internal borders that are created, in general, like, in general, borders are always a bad thing. So, I think that people often think of nationalism as the opposite of imperialism, when actually nationalism, like, you know, you can get rid of nationalism is more of the child of imperialism, like the idea of borders themselves and the people being separated by nations is itself a European idea and has no basis in any pre-colonial state. There was no such thing as this state should belong to Bengalis and no one else. No one had these ideas until basically the French Revolution, where it said that France should be for the French. and then it spreads around Europe and then around the world with European colonization. So I don't think that there's any way to draw a good border other than potentially following geographical features like mountains and sea. The Arabian states produced so little violence is because there was a sort of natural order in some sense. But so I don't think there's anything so good as a natural border that you can draw on land, really. But in general, I think that there's more of an importance is what you do with the borders you inherit. No one ever chooses their borders. And I think the key thing is don't screw over your minorities. Make a scenario such that different communities can voice their grievances without it falling apart. It's any nation should be viewed a bit similar to a family or a relationship where you need to treat each other with respect. And any nation that devolves into a hegemony of one community over another is gearing itself up for, grievances and internal civil war. And so I think it's a difficult thing, like when you ask what Radcliffe could have done, because he wasn't, of course, just tasked with dividing Hindu majority districts from Muslim majority districts, but also with drawing the border such that these would actually be viable states. And but it's interesting how many different ways these all could have gone, and the kind of rather random nature of many of these borders. The fact that Jinnah, when he launches the Pakistan demand, he imagines Kolkata being the main capital of Pakistan because it was the capital of the biggest Muslim majority state. And today, Kolkata is the other side of the subcontinent, and Bangladesh is a separate nation, and we don't associate it at all with Pakistan.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you, Sam. There's a question from Professor Priyatosh Sharma. He says, are we not subjecting history of India as mirror of other modern powers with an idea of hegemon, where there are areas of influences perceived not as collaboration and equality, but as subtle superiority? And then Professor Sharma says, thus regions, not nations, become conflicted mostly with mild dosage of collaboration. Thus, should we overcome the modern quest of locating hegemon or superior, not collaborators within the region, like Asia or South Asia? Secondly, and there's a second part of the question. So, should I read both the questions out to you, or you take this part first?
Sure, let me just go through it myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think that there's a basic thing that any relation, there are power imbalances in every relationship. Um, the idea of hegemony, um, the quest of locating hegemon or superior, not collaborators within the regions, India currently is the major power in South Asia. Um, there is a huge amount of collaboration and equality that exists within some of its relations, international relations, and internally. And then there are moments of demonstrations of power. And I think that, what we are seeing right now with the States, for example, is we're seeing return to the world where power equals how things operate, as opposed to the kind of previous so-called rules-based order that Harney was recently dismissing. So I think that the second question is one that I can answer particularly well, which is how to locate the history of the partition of India and its unresolved boundaries with those drawn in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. I think that they are all incredibly related. And I think that so often we talk about partition with a capital P and, don't want, because it's such a deep trauma, don't want to compare it to any similar things. But in fact, I think, for example, the breakup of Yugoslavia and the ethnic warfare that developed there in the 1990s, you get similar sort of stories, the way that a sort of fraught coexistence transforms into full ethnic cleansing. I think there's this idea that we often get into of everyone lived in peace and then suddenly this happened. It's far more similar to other events that have been going on in Eastern Europe. Israel, Palestine, and particularly Ireland are particularly interesting because the idea of religious partition was tried out 3 times. And it was first tried out in Ireland. And when the partition of India is occurring, they are explicitly referring in relation to the partition of Ireland along Catholic and Protestant lines. And they're talking about worrying about creating little Ulsters, Ulster being a region of Ireland. 6 months after the partition of India and Pakistan, the British Mandate of Palestine is divided on the basis of the same reasoning. And I think Faisal Devji has done uh, a brilliant book on basically a comparative study of the partition of India and Pakistan and the partition of Israel and Israel and Palestine. And the differences and similarities in the movements. So, he calls the Pakistan demand Muslim Zion, and they were similar demands, but they also had major, major differences. Um, the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think, has not been studied in the way that it needs to be. All books that you read about the fall of the Soviet Union focus on places like, basically kind of Moscow and a few other major cities, or St. Petersburg, and maybe a bit of East Germany. We haven't had the full comparative story that talks and gives equal respect to the birth of nations like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, to the nations like Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. I think it's important for us to try and apply some of the lessons learned from partition studies elsewhere, just as much as a lot of oral history techniques that I've learned, and Anshul Malhotra and Anam Zakaria and other oral historians working in the partition space. A lot of it's rooted in philosophies created in the oral histories of Holocaust studies, right? And people who studied the Holocaust. This is something that you mentioned Indochina, and Indochina is actually potentially something that I'm planning to work on in the future, applying partition the philosophies and theory of partition studies, and the approach of oral histories to the breakup of Indochina, and its relationship with places like Pondicherry and French India. But how did one Indochina turn into Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia? I think there's a guy called Benedict Anderson who is a brilliant scholar on nationalism, and he asks this very provocative question: why is it that when imperialism came to an end, an imagined nation called Indochina fell apart and became Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and yet the imagined idea of Indonesia that had also never existed before persisted? Why was that? Why was one nationalism able to take into account all of its different identities, and why was one not? And he traces a whole load of things. One in particular was the fact that in Indonesia, all of the elites from all of the different islands had all been educated in Jakarta, so they had a common reference frame. Whereas, Laotians, Cambodians, and Vietnamese often were studied in separate schools, and there were 3 major centers of education, which meant that there wasn't the same cultural reference points to persist after imperialism. And I think one of the strengths of the Indian nation has been the way that it's pinned its nationhood in a kind of, distant pre-colonial idea, which is Bharat Varsh.
Thank you, Professor Sharma. Thank you, Sam. I think with this, we come to the end of our discussion on Shattered Lands. Thank you very much, Sam, for
Thank you so much for having me.
accepting our invite and giving this wonderful talk on a new lens to look at not just 1 or 2 partitions of India, but 5 partitions of India, like you said. And now that you've mentioned about social media, I'm going to give you a heads up. So I will give you a message that we're going to send a collaboration request. So please do
Sure.
accept that so that doesn't get lost.
Yeah.
And we look forward to your work on Indochina next. And we look forward to having you back for another discussion on the next book that you write. Uh, Till then, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Sam Dalrymple for his time. And I also thank you on behalf of MBC for your time. Thank you,
The
everyone.
same. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.